using this time to go to the supermarket and pick up my ingredients and come home and really just focus for maybe an hour a day on cooking something different, or just chopping or stirring or boiling things, or just flicking through a cookbook, really became a way for me to just escape from all this complexity of the financial world and of the wider world at that point, and just really engage my brain, but in a way that was very relaxing and soothing. Actually, it was a great way for me to switch off. So I suppose it became a point where it was relaxation for me, but equally I always had the passion for the eating side of it. So yeah, it was a real convergence of a lot of different things. And yeah, it's one positive that I'm definitely taking with me from the COVID-19 pandemic.
I'm Aoife Devitt, and welcome to the 50 Faces podcast, a podcast committed to revealing the richness and diversity of the world of investment by focusing on its people and their stories. This is our love series, and we are focusing not only on careers, but also on loves that are nurtured alongside them. Let's hear now about not only a career, but also about food, glorious food. I'm joined today by John Harney, who's a senior consultant with AON, where he focuses on helping pension scheme sponsors to manage pension risks and maximize potential upside. He's based in the Oxford area. I came across John through mutual friends in the industry, and because I was drawn in particular to his LinkedIn post that mentioned his joy in cooking and baking. Let's find out more. Welcome, John. Thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, let's start with your background and career journey, because as a fellow Irish person, you have definitely touched some destinations that are familiar to me.
Yes. So it all started, and it probably sounds a little bit twee, I suppose, and a little bit typically Irish, but being a farmer's son, actually, I grew up in rural Ireland on an organic farm and went to a lovely country school for my primary education, which was really lovely way to grow up and do all of that before the internet and all of that came along. I then went on to secondary school and really saw how much I loved mathematics and science and business. And I remember it very well, actually, that my career guidance teacher said to me, "Oh, well, you're really good at these things. Would you be an actuary?" And I didn't even know what an actuary was at this stage. And to those of you who are listening who may not have heard of an actuary or what we do, it's about managing financial risk, essentially, and trying to predict the future, but not always getting it right, I suppose. And it was something that sounded really interesting to me. And I ended up studying that as my first degree at university, which I really, really enjoyed. And yeah, I then started off my career in the pensions industry.
Well, there were a few surprising turns that a tour through your LinkedIn profile will indicate, because you spent some time studying not only to be an actuary, but also theology, as well as music. I'd love to know what you've learned from diving deep into those disciplines.
Yeah, it was, I suppose, a bit of a left turn and not your typical career journey. So as I say, I started off working as an actuary, and I did that for about a year. And at that point, I did consider whether my life and career would take a very different direction in terms of looking at theology, philosophy, and music. And I suppose I learned a lot from that time in my life. It was about 5 years studying those disciplines. And one of the things really was how to use those transferable skills that I had. Now, transferable skills may sound like a little bit of a cliche to people because it's something that we hear about a lot, particularly of people navigating their careers and using those transferable skills. But it really is a cliche because it's true, I would say. So as somebody who was very mathematical and logical and probably slightly binary about things, having studied mathematics for 4 years at university, I realized that I could transfer that to philosophy and theology, because what you're essentially doing at the very core is taking an argument or a question and following it through to its logical conclusion. So all I really needed to do was use those same thought processes and I suppose dress them up a little bit into a lovely sounding essay or thought piece or whatever it was. But it was very much using those same skills, but just transferring them to a very, very different context. And similarly with the music, I had always played music and I'd played a lot of Irish music. And I suppose with Irish music, you're doing a lot of improvisation, you're making things up as you go along. And then when I moved to study it in more of an academic context, I actually found that you had to use a lot of formulas. You know, you had to think about chords, you had to think about cadences, and all of that was a formula. So those things that sound pleasant to our ears and that we love hearing, to link back to the theme, that we love hearing, they're born out of formulas and there's ways of making things sound lovely. So again, I was taking something that I had some knowledge of in a more informal context and applying those problem solving techniques and thought processes and making something hopefully great, but something that I really, really enjoyed as well. And I think that's a very long way of answering your question in saying that it really did just teach me that I can stand up to be counted and have confidence in myself in different contexts, because at its core, there will always be a skill that I am good at. I may need to learn the specifics and I may need to drink in the context, but I'm able to carry myself and hold myself in those situations, which I think is a really great thing to have happened in my life. And after doing all of that study, I actually opted to return back to the actuarial world. As you probably heard in the intro to the listeners there, I'm working as a pensions consultant. So even though I took that kind of left turn for a little while and then returned back to the financial services sector, it's not a wasted journey and it wasn't a waste of time. And it's given me so many skills and so much confidence, I suppose, to navigate my career and to navigate the world of pensions and investments.
Oh, absolutely. I would imagine by no means would it be a waste of time. I'm actually quite curious as to how the skills go the other way, because not only did your experience in the actuarial world give you the confidence to plunge into two other worlds, but I would also imagine that you learned a lot from there that you've now taken back into your professional career.
Well, exactly. And I've spoken a lot about the technical problem solving, mathematical, analytical side. But I always say as an actuary, I'm not just an actuary, I'm someone who is a business person. And one of those key things that I learned in that time studying philosophy and theology and music was how to forge human relationships and how to have people really trust you. And some of those kind of theological contexts that I was in, where I'd be working in hospitals and schools and parishes, and people would really trust you, and you would have to not make them trust you, but you would have to make sure that you were someone that they felt that they could go to. So in order to be able to develop those deep relationships, I had to kind of work a lot on myself. And then I was able to take all of that work and those abilities and bring them back into the business world, because as a business person, I feel like relationships and trust are the foundation of anything. I'm working in a highly competitive industry, and I suppose all actuaries are very competent and very, I suppose we all make sure that we do a great job and we're very, very thorough about things. So that's a baseline, that's a given. So actually, if you're able to make connections with people and build those deep relationships and really be able to empathize with clients, that can be a really big differentiator and a reason why my clients choose to work with me rather than other people. So it really has become, and you'll excuse the musical pun, but it really has become a string to my bow that I've been able to transfer back into the business world.
I love that expression. Let's talk a little bit about the business world before we move on to your other passions. I'd love to know what's at the forefront of your mind now in the work you do with pension fund clients. What's coming up over and over again?
There's a lot going on, and I think that's the thing that keeps on coming up is just the sheer volume of things that are kind of avalanching their way towards my clients. So obviously the pandemic has had an impact, but I think even before then, what we were seeing here in the context in the UK was that there's an awful lot of regulatory scrutiny on pension funds, which is only intensifying. And on the investment side of things, obviously, there's a lot of scrutiny in terms of climate disclosures and making sure that pension funds, as very substantial holders of assets, are doing their part to combat climate change. So I think for me, what's at the forefront of my mind is metaphorically holding my client's hand and guiding them through what is quite an overwhelming environment in order to either run a pension scheme or sponsor a pension scheme. So it's very much about taking what is the big priority for them and what they should be doing about it and distilling that down and taking it step by step and not just overwhelming them with all of this. So we have seen in the UK specifically recently that a lot of pension schemes are actually in a better state now than they were perhaps a year ago. So there has been a lot of market volatility, particularly in the UK. I don't need to tell your listeners the details of that. They can infer that. But in late 2022, things moved quite substantially. And because so many of my clients are now in a better position, it's kind of a question of what now? So it's really interesting kind of guiding them through all of these complications and all this market volatility and all this regulatory scrutiny and helping them keep things in the right perspective, I suppose.
And that may well have led me to the post that led me to you, which was the post around, I think, some of the relaxation factor, how you de-stress in cooking and baking. And given the volatility that is the backdrop to our lives and our careers, probably more important now than ever. Can you talk us through that love and passion and where that originated?
Well, it's a really good question because I've really had to think about this one. And I've always loved food. And I think part of that is growing up on a farm because you really have a sense of where things come from. And we were very fortunate that animal welfare and sustainability and everything was very at the forefront of my parents as they farmed of their minds. And that was a great example to see. So that kind of fostered a love of food. And then I was very fortunate that my sister, hopefully she won't mind me mentioning her, is a very, very accomplished cook and baker. So she has actually appeared on the Great Irish Bake Off, so a cookery baking competition in Ireland almost 10 years ago now. She appeared on that. And I suppose what that meant was I was always a little bit spoiled in that I could taste beautiful food, beautiful baking, and not actually have to play any role in preparing it. And then if we cut to the pandemic and the quarantines and lockdown rules that we all had to navigate at that time across the world. And it was a challenging time for so many people in so many ways. And I found myself keeping the rules, and my one trip of the week would be to hop in the car and queue up and go into the supermarket and pick up the weekly food shop. So it became this kind of focal point of the week. And it just got me thinking of, well, why don't I do something with this? And why don't I let this be something in itself? So I was very fortunate that I had my sister on speed dial, but also that the wonderful Nigella Lawson was launching a new book and had a new TV series at that exact time. You would swear she planned it. I bet she didn't, but it's just how it worked out. And I was able to just take the very, very little skill that I had, basically non-existent cookery skills and baking skills, and develop them and make something of this trip that I used to make every week. And the other piece of context to all of this was that I was at that point navigating the end of my actuarial exams. And those of you who are listening who have done professional exams of any type will know that they're no mean feat and they can be really, really challenging. So that was kind of another cause of, I suppose, stress and anxiety, and using this time to go to the supermarket and pick up my ingredients and come home and really just focus for maybe an hour a day on cooking something different, or just chopping or stirring or boiling things, or just flicking through a cookbook, really became a way for me to just escape from all this complexity of the financial world and of the wider world at that point, and just really engage my brain, but in a way that was very relaxing and soothing. Actually, it was a great way for me to switch off. So I suppose it became a point where it was relaxation for me, but equally, I always had the passion for the eating side of it. So yeah, it was a real convergence of a lot of different things. And yeah, it's one positive that I'm definitely taking with me from the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, certainly the healing power of food is something we've discussed already on this podcast, and it is definitely something we all became aware of. One thing that struck me about your LinkedIn post was it seemed to suggest that the goal was not perfection. Now, obviously with your sister, I'm sure you're used to very high standards, but there was a simpler, more attainable, realistic goal perhaps there. Is that how you see cooking? Not about perfection, but about enjoyment?
Exactly. That's exactly how I see it. And it's very much, again, referring back to Nigella Lawson as well, that's very much her philosophy, is that if you make something as best you can, you do not need to be able to chop an onion into the tiniest, most even pieces to create something that people will enjoy eating and that you will enjoy preparing. So yeah, it's very much about progress, not perfection. And I remember when I was first trying to bake bread, and bread specifically with yeast. And let's just say I had to try and eat a lot of very flat bread and try and make it taste good by toasting it. And I tried all sorts to try and bring things back. But it was that if my second loaf was a little less flat than the first one, I knew I had tweaked something and I had made progress. So I really enjoyed that sense that, I'm making a bit of progress, I'm doing something right. And I really, really enjoyed that as well, that thankfully those in my household ate every single attempt, which was very, very kind. But it was about progressing and making things better, but it's just enjoying the whole process along the way and not taking myself too seriously, because in the actuarial world and in the investment world, we tend to be quite hard on ourselves, I would say. And actually through cooking and baking, I learned to enjoy that process and to make the best of things, and I suppose not to beat myself up quite so much.
Well, I love that the continuous improvement certainly is a goal for all of us in every walk of life. Before we leave the food conversation, is there any signature dish now that you would say is your specialty, your hallmark?
Well, I suppose it is a signature dish in that, and I don't want to build it up too much, but I think I've kind of invented something, because I've attempted to make a loaf of bread and used a little bit too much water, I think. So actually it ended up looking like a loaf of bread, but the inside of it looks like a crumpet. So it's got loads of little holes. So I've affectionately called it the croaf, which is a cross between a crumpet and a loaf. But it tastes very nice. I think it probably has become my signature dish, because I do intentionally make it like that now. And maybe it is my way of plastering over the fact I haven't quite mastered bread making. But yeah, that's my signature dish, I'd say.
Well, I'll commission a whole batch of croafs with 50 Faces podcast on the label just to promote this. So thank you, Doc, for that.
Yeah,
for planting a new seed. It may not trip off the tongue just yet, but I'm sure it's only a matter of time.
Exactly.
So let's move back now to some personal reflections. So would you say there were any key people throughout the course of your career or life in general who had a pivotal role?
Definitely. And I think I have been very fortunate throughout my whole career to have great people as my managers, my mentors. And I've had some amazing women who have really, really supported me in my career and encouraged me and helped me to take things further. So even when I took my break from the actuarial world and was studying back in university, the theology and philosophy and the music, my manager for my first actuarial job would email me every kind of springtime and say, do you have time? Would you like to come back and do some work with us for the summer, or for a couple of weeks we can find you a project, or whatever the situation may be. And it was really, really, really lovely to have that support, because it really felt like she was in my corner and affirming the choices that I was making. But equally, she was helping me kind of keep my toe in the actuarial water, in the pensions and investment water, so to speak. So that was really, really brilliant, really, really great. And it was a real influence on me, in that it demonstrated to me how to support other people and how to really make sure that you affirm other people's choices in a really healthy way. And I suppose it was deeds, not words in that case. It really was very, very powerful. So yeah, Maria was absolutely fantastic. And then there was one other person who influenced me, and that was a rather elderly priest. One day I was chatting away and I was being very, very hard on myself about everything. And if I'm honest, I can't even remember what I was being hard on myself about. But I just was being very, very hard on myself, and being harder on myself than I would be on anyone else if they had found themselves in a similar circumstance. And the priest just turned around to me and said, well, welcome to the human race. And it was just such a wonderful way of stopping me in my tracks and helping me take that step back and think, well, actually, I'm just human, just like everyone else. I need to just snap out of it and stop this kind of unhealthy thought process. And I suppose that's something I've really taken with me, and it's really influenced me, because I do strive to, and I don't necessarily succeed all the time, but I do strive to remind myself of that when I am going down that rabbit hole of self-criticism. And I think that's really changed my life in many ways, just those few little words. So yeah, there's some of the key people who've had a really great influence on me.
It's really interesting, because I would imagine those few words from that elderly priest unlock an empathy as well for other people, because everybody else is also human and they make mistakes and they experience self-doubt. And I also loved your previous boss's attitude towards your, as you call it, your turn left, or towards your exploring other interests. Because I think when you spot talent and energy and commitment in a person, even if they divert that somewhere else for a period, that quality has not disappeared. So I can totally see why that might generally frame how we look at decisions made by people, is looking at, well, are they bringing that zeal, that energy to something else? Well, then they're still the same
exactly.
person. Yeah.
And I think as well, to go back to another point about kind of those transferable skills, it is not that you're playing a game, but you're playing a long game, and you're looking at the wider, longer horizon. And you're saying, well, the world is a small place, and this person has something that I admire and that I can see real potential in. And you're really bearing with that person as they find their passion and find their way. And you're preparing for a time that may or may not come to fruition, where your paths will cross again, or you'll be on parallel paths and can help each other again. So it really, to me, showed a huge wisdom and a huge sense of being really, truly magnanimous in the truest sense of that word, and that she had a big heart, still does, and has been tremendously supportive of me. So yeah, I completely agree.
And it gets back to the game analogy. Life is a repeated game, obviously, not a one shot. So keeping relationships warm. Actually, I'm just going to ask one question out of order, because it triggered this discussion. The question of diversity in the profession, as was your first profession in pensions and actuarial work. How have you experienced that evolving through the course of your career?
I'm really happy to be able to say I've seen an awful lot of progress in that sense. And I think on so many different measures of diversity, and I suppose that might not be the best term to use, but I think if you look at gender diversity, ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, diversity in terms of sexual orientation, all of those facets that everyone has and brings to the table, I feel like we've seen over the course of my post-university life, I suppose, in professional services, a huge increase in awareness. And it does feel as though, particularly as a result of, again, the pandemic and the Black Lives Movement around that time, huge strides in terms of that awareness, but also the numbers of people who are from previously underrepresented groups really, I suppose, being listened to as a very first step, listened to in the corporate world. But also, I know from working at AON, I've been blown away just by how many women have been promoted to senior positions, even just in my time at AON over the past year or so, and how they are supported in making decisions that are best for them, and if it is the case, in their families as well. So I do think we've seen huge change. Obviously, the work isn't done, but I feel like the roots of something really, really great starting to grow. And yeah, I strive to be part of that as well. And again, I modeled that on Maria, my first boss, that I try not to just talk about it. And that's probably why, even as I'm talking to you, I'm not quite sure if I'm using the right words. And it's because I try to drink it in, and I try to not just parrot words and phrases, but I try to live it every day. I try to empathize with that person who is on mute for the whole call, who isn't being asked their opinion. And I always try to include them as an example. So yeah, I think we've made huge progress, but I think there's a lot still to be done. And I'm excited to hopefully be part of that movement.
And it's interesting that you did highlight Maria's role, because I think I agree with you that at the entry level, we're seeing great progress. We're seeing great progress in terms of the initiatives companies are adopting and their own mission around diversity and inclusion. I think what's still missing are more Marias, more leaders that are already in leadership roles that can be mentors, can show us the way. So thank you for amplifying what she did. But also, I think that's probably what I perceive has been the biggest gap. My last question, John, is around any advice you'd have for your younger self, or any creed or motto that you've developed over your life that you can share with us now.
I don't know if it's a motto of how I live my life, but it's something I try and remind myself, which is nothing's the end of the world except the end of the world. So to put that in some context, I think if John, finishing his first degree at university, about to take on his first graduate role in pensions and investments, if he could see where I am now, I think he'd be flabbergasted. I think he really, really would be thinking, what in goodness sake have you done? You've taken so many twists and turns, and you've landed somewhere very different to what I had planned. And I think that's great now. So the John now thinks that's great. And I think I would remind my younger self that those twists and turns and those things that might seem like the end of the world are not the end of the world. And actually, they're just a different opportunity and a different way either to go where you wanted to go, or a different way to go somewhere different. That's probably even better than what you imagined. So it's reminding yourself of that. And for instance, when I decided to leave the actuarial world, that felt a bit like the end of the world because it was so unknown what was out there. And equally, when I decided to re-enter the actuarial world, it felt a bit like the end of the world because so many of my classmates from university had qualified and were in management positions and really stomping through their careers. And I just had to remind myself, no, this isn't the end of the world. And my journey is my journey. And all of our journeys are unpredictable. So I think that's what I'd say to I'm going to say younger John, because I'd like to think I'm not old yet, but you know what I mean.
Well, thank you so much, John. You've reminded me that it is our twists and turns that make us who we are. They're not necessarily sideshows. They are what make us whole. And I've thoroughly enjoyed this rich discussion with one of the most authentic people I've come across in the industry. So thank you for coming here and sharing your insights with us.
No problem. And thank you so much. And keep up the great work with the podcast as well.
I'm Aoife Devitt. Thank you for listening to the 50 Faces podcast. If you liked what you heard and would like to tune in to hear more inspiring investors and their personal journeys, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as investment advice, and all views are personal and should not be attributed to the organisations and affiliations of the host or any guest.